Story number 1 of Hooded Detective. 6 Pulp Detective Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dan Grzinski. Hooded Detective. 6 Pulp Detective Stories. Story number 1. Candidate for a Coffin by T.W. Ford. Death stood on the Times Square subway platform, uptown side, waiting for a subject. Death looked at himself in the gum machine mirror, then down at his watch. It was exactly 4:12 p.m., Wednesday, December 10th. When the second hand hit the 30 mark, he would turn around, and the person nearest would be it. Death wore a blue pinstriped suit, well-fitting but slightly unpressed. Death's name was Wilson Lamb. The second hand wiped over the 20 of the smaller dial, jittered on toward the half-minute spot, inexorable and meaningless, just as what Wilson Lamb planned. He said, "Now," with a little sucking in of breath and a thin anticipant smile and a spun on his heel. He was a slim, saturnine-faced man, with cigarette ash stain on a coat lapel, undistinguished from any typical strap-hanger, except, perhaps, by the light-hued eyes. His shoes needed a shine. He lifted the pale eyes from them and looked for the corpse-to-be. To the left, to the right. Then he came as near recoiling from the thing as he ever would. It looked as if it might be a woman. Somehow he had always thought of killing a man, something that could strike back. Not that he would get the chance, it was just the idea of the thing. But she, the woman, was descending the stairs that led up to the shuttle, bearing down toward him less than 20 feet away, big and billowy and red-faced, waddling along like a sow. To face a jury, charged with doing away with a hunk of human beef like that, and... He flashed a glance to the left again. Nobody near. It was a fluke of circumstance. A score of people weren't buzzing all about him. He whipped his eyes back toward the woman as a local thundered in, and luck took a hand. A stocky man dodged around from behind the woman and came rapidly down the platform, neat, crisp, briefcase under his arm. Wilson Lamb's pale eyes flickered with amusement. He said softly, "Tag, you're it, John W. Goon." This was his corpse-to-be. Mr. Death had made his pickup. "Excuse me." An express rolled in, and cutting over for it, the stocky man brushed Lamb. His voice was mild, colorless. He wore a gray snap-brim hat. It was set squarely on his head, precisely level. Lamb had seen hats worn like that by show window clothing dummies. The man entered the third car, middle door. Wilson Lamb boarded it on his heels. His victim almost got a seat. A pimply-faced office boy elbowed him out of it, and the man turned away meekly. He hooked himself onto a strap, hitched the briefcase up under his free arm, and concentrated on a segment of his folded-open newspaper. It was one of the conservative sheets, comicless, reactionary Republican to the core. Wilson eased down the aisle, casually pushing a woman out of his way, and glanced over his victim's shoulder. The goon was studying an advertisement for a 9-piece living room suite, overstuffed at special reduction this week only. It was at one of the better department stores. Amusement flickered in Wilson Lamb's pale eyes. He got the picture. A typical George Babbitt in the flesh, to the core. At 72nd Street, the stocky man got a seat. When he faced the light, Lamb saw he was turning slightly gray over the ears. He had a roundish face, a little fleshy under the chin, a soft-lipped mouth that from habit he held slightly pursed, muddy eyes. He was inclined to plumpness. Somebody had scuffed his right shoe in getting out, and now he pulled up the pant leg of his dark gray suit to study it ruefully. Typical taxpayer, Lamb said to himself, savoring it. Always makes his insurance payments on time. Probably has weak arches. Is going to buy the 5-foot bookshelf. Always next week. And read it. Would like to get up the nerve enough to take that blonde steno at the office out to luncheon. Wilson Lamb wanted to laugh out loud. It was as good as having a duck flutter down smack in front of your blind. Past 86th, the express roared. Lamb's victim had turned his paper, halved back the last page. Automatic pencil poised, he was scanning the crossword puzzle intently. As they lulled through 91st, he bared his teeth in a satisfied smile and rapidly filled in 4 vertical blanks, then filled out the lower right-hand corner. Lamb saw that his 4 upper front teeth were a neatly fitted denture. He wondered how they'd look after a bullet had gone through them. The victim got off at 96th, carefully straightening his muffler inside his black overcoat. He went downstairs, crossed beneath the local platform to the west side, mounted to street level. He had a cigarette in his mouth, but waited until he was outside the subway entrance before he put a match to it. Lamb lit one too. He picked up an evening paper from the newsstand. It might come in handy if he got to close quarters with the dope and wanted to mask his face. The newsdealer was looking the other way as he made change, so Lamb plucked back his nickel. The victim started to cross 96th Street, heading north. A traffic officer's whistle shrilled. Broadway was spattered with the ruby red of traffic lights. Vehicles moved crosstown. Dutifully, Lamb's goon turned and retraced his steps to the curb, holding his 4-square hat carefully. A little trick with skimpy skirts whipped about plump calves crossed on over. Watching her, Lamb's victim shook his head. Lamb could hear him saying, "Tisk, tisk. Foolish to take chances like that." Imagine him saying it anyway. Lamb kept at a cautious distance as they moved several blocks up Broadway. Walking briskly, the victim turned onto a side street. There was something smug about the way he picked up his heels, swung his briefcase. "Little man who has had a busy day with a job well done," Lamb paraphrased it sarcastically. He pushed his battered felt hat further back on his head in a gesture of disgust. His cheap, unbuttoned Raglan-style coat fluttered in the wind off the Hudson. Abruptly, the man had halted, wheeled. Lamb calmly turned and opened the rear door of a parked sedan, whose driver was at the wheel. Put a foot in. Down the block, his victim headed into a distinctly second-rate apartment hotel. Lamb said to the sedan driver, "I thought this was a hearse," and went down the block. His victim was getting his mail at the desk when Lamb entered the shabby lobby. Lamb got on the elevator after him. The victim said, "9." Immersed in his paper again, studying that living-room suite. He had his key ready in his hand. Terracotta-hued tab swinging loose. 914 was lettered on it in black. 10, bud, Lamb told the operator. On the 10th floor, he moved quickly down the frayed carpet of a corridor and found the service stairs. Back on the 9th, even when he was yards from the door of 914, he caught the odor of cooking. Rich and greasy. He got his ear against the door. "Spare ribs and sauerkraut, huh, Edie?" the victim was calling out inside. Lamb could visualize him putting his coat on a hanger, carefully folding a scarf over it. From the rear of the apartment came Edie's voice, reedy with a bit of a whine. Lamb could visualize her, too, a dyed blonde who devoured film fan magazines and thought the girdle was the world's greatest invention. "Uh-huh. How'd things go downtown today, Lou?" Through the thin door, Lamb heard him clear his throat and mutter, "Oh, so-so." But Edie wasn't to be put off. "Lou, did you tell the boss you had to have a raise, that the job is worth more?" Lou started to mumble something. Edie's voice, penetrating the door easily, rose to a querulous pitch. "Lou, you're too easygoing. You ain't got the sense to stand up for your rights. You're an expert in your line, and you know it. There's never any kickback or complaint on a job you do." I know, Edie, but Wilson Lamb's victim got in. You're entitled to more money, Lou. You've never bungled a job yet. I need a new coat, and you said you wanted to put the kid in a private school after the first of the year. How are we going to do it if you don't? Lou said, Look, Edie, something came up today, and the boss had to leave in a hurry, right in the middle of a conference. I just had time to grab my briefcase myself. Let's get to work on those spare ribs. They moved toward the rear of the apartment, and Lamb out in the hall could hear no more. He was chuckling as he walked away. Lou's mouth curled in a sneer. Back on the 10th floor, he boarded the elevator again. Again, it was empty except for the operator, a tow-headed kid with a racing form tucked in a side pocket. Funny thing, Lamb mentioned casually. I could have sworn I knew the man who rode up with me. Stocky chap, got off at the 9th, but I can't seem to recall his name. Mr. Engel, you mean? Engel. Lou Engel? Is he an accountant? Yeah, Louis Engel's the name, but he ain't no accountant. Comes from Chicago. I heard him tell the manager he was an efficiency expert. Lamb stopped rattling the coins in his pocket suggestively, kept them there, and strolled toward the main entrance. Behind him, a lobby lounger moved over to the elevator boy, jerking his chin in Wilson Lamb's direction as he asked a question. At the corner, Lamb stopped in and bought a drink. Thin face creased in a smile of self-satisfaction. He glanced at the paper he had bought. Below the latest war communiques was a small column head about a threatened gang war in the numbers racket. Police raid Joe the Flasher Abadiro's headquarters, it said. Lamb's eyes picked up flashes of it when plainclothes squad walked into luxurious apartment, Midtown West Side Hotel, several henchmen taken into custody on technical charges. Abadiro reported out of town. Police acting on tip, killers imported from Chicago. Showdown anticipated on who will boss numbers racket in metropolitan area. Lamb turned the paper over and winked at himself in the concave mirror of the semicircle of bar. That was an important claptrap to somebody like him. That kind of tripe was for the little Joe dopes who got their thrills vicariously. There was going to be nothing vicarious about what he was going to do. He was going to rub out Louis Engel. Blast him. Louis the Goon, as he had already christened him in his mind. He had put the finger on him. Louis the Goon is going to die, Wilson Lamb said softly. He liked the sound of it. He wasn't crazy. Long ago he had assured himself of that. It was just that his mind operated at a different, a higher plane than the norm. He was not one of the little pieces of protoplasm running along with the herd. He was above them, looking down on them, studying them. His perspective ranged somewhat further than the end of his nose. The latest double feature at the neighborhood movie house and spare ribs. That last made him laugh out loud. He picked up his change and headed back for the subway and his two-room apartment in the village. His gun, a .45 automatic, was there. He would be needing it soon. Louis the Goon practically demanded, invited the use of a .45 automatic on him. Efficiency engineer, Lamb said to himself once. The guy was the perfect subject, ripe for murder. The more Lamb thought of it, the more he was convinced he couldn't have dreamt up a better stooge. Engel was a model for homicide. He himself might die for it, but that was unimportant. The killing of Louis the Goon was the only thing that counted. The results, materially speaking, meant nothing. This slaying was to be an exposition of the ego, without other cause, emotionless, with no hope of gain, financial or otherwise. No female involved, nothing. Just a killing, a plain open and shut case of homicide for no earthly reason imaginable to the police. It would be amusing to watch those flatfoots sitting around trying to sift a motive out of the thing. Baby, they'd sweat their so-and-sos off trying to cook up a reason for this one. It was so simple to Lamb himself. Inevitable. A logical step in a sequence. The final step, perhaps. Louis the Goon Engel was a mere walk-on in the piece. A spear carrier doomed to death. little better than a papier-mâché dummy set up to be the target for the custard pie, only in this case, the custard pie was to be a cupro steel-nosed bullet. To Lamb, it boiled down to an ultimate expression of the psyche, the final test of one's ability to project the personal ego over all else in the material world. Because the ego was the alpha and omega of all living the moment one got above the level of animal existence. The mere feeding of the face and satisfaction of the other instinctive physical hungers. As Braunich had put it so succinctly, even the lowest worm can procreate itself, unfortunately. Then, of course, there was Nietzsche and his Superman, and some of Freud in that treatise of Van der Water, the Belgian, on the sublimation of the subconscious by the negation of the self-censor, and the papers of Bralinsky of the old University of Warsaw on the fear of trauma, which he termed a birthmark of civilization. Lamb had gone into them all deeply, all of them dealing with the ego and its development and complete consummation. And the killing of Louis the Goon Engel was going to be the consummation of Wilson Lamb's experiments in the total exemplification of that ego. It was no brash idea, no harebrained impulse concocted in one's cups, perhaps. Analytically, objectively, he had thought out the whole thing. The axis of life was the psyche. Its two poles were birth and death. And as Braunich had stated, the former was a function, often accidental, of which the lowest animal order was capable. A monocell, the amoeba, was able to reproduce itself by the simple stratagem of subdivision. But death, when it became a deliberate action, administered without emotion or hope of material gain, was one step removed from the Godhead, perhaps less than one step, but the step that would raise one above all the little fumbling, blind, spawning, life-hugging bipeds who infested the scene. In short, birth was fortuitous, a product of circumstance plus proximity. Its get a biological accident, but death, the taking of life, was a selective process, intentionally executed, the result of foreseen conclusion. In so doing, the taking of life, you broke the greatest law of humanity and so became above it. You unfettered the ego with a single ineradicable stroke. In taking a life, one tasted the essence of living. He tried to remember who had said that. De Maupassant had put it better, but Lamb could not quite recall the quotation. He was still trying to remember it as he lounged down the block from Engel's apartment hotel at 8:10 the next morning. There was a bone-chilling breeze off the drive that made Lamb belt his coat tighter about him. When at 9:35 Louis the Goon Engel had not made an appearance, Lamb went down to the corner drugstore and had a cup of coffee. He could not see the entrance of the hotel through the window, but he commanded a clear view of the street and anybody coming up it toward the subway. And if he ever saw one, his corpse-to-be was a methodical little piece of humanity. He would come and go to the subway by the same route. Wilson Lamb was correct as he had never doubted. But it was 11:07 by his wristwatch before Engel emerged, the gray hat just as squarely set on his head as before. Without a glance around, Engel came out of the hotel and turned his steps dutifully in the direction of the subway. Lamb was strolling on the other side of the street at the moment. On sight of him, he turned up the front stairs of a brownstone. But a few seconds later, his long legs were carrying him rapidly toward Broadway. By hustling, he got to the other side of it, entered the subway on the uptown side, crossed underneath, and was waiting in the bypass when Engel came along. Engel trotted up to the downtown express platform. When the next train pulled out, Lamb was in the vestibule, half a car length away from him. Taking the trouble to keep at a distance, to make himself inconspicuous, seemed almost wasted effort. Louis the Goon went along, looking neither to the right nor left, docilely intent on minding his own business. Efficiency expert, Lamb said to himself. Bet he's a crackerjack at cutting down on the overhead. It was like playing a game of cat and mouse with him. Wilson Lamb the cat. Only in this instance, the mouse seemed as good as blind. Lamb could have given it to him any time. A slug in the back that would terminate his little life the way you would step on a cockroach. On second thought, he would not give it to him in the back. It would be the front, so he could see the stricken, stupid look of surprise. He'd probably try to get his foolish little briefcase in front of him like a shield. Lamb could just see it, hear his squeal of futile protest, too. Yes, he could give it to him whenever he chose. Just walk up to him and squeeze the trigger and savor omnipotence for a moment. Very simple. At his leisure. But Wilson Lamb wasn't going to do it that way. That would have been like a blind stab in the dark, meaningless, impersonal, like taking a hack at a piece of meat, or tossing a bomb into a crowd. Instead, he wanted to know something about his specimen before he exterminated him. Understand his background. Get a fair picture of the little sphere of the life from which he was all unknowingly about to depart. Lamb didn't figure it to take long in the case of Louis the Goon. What Engel was pretty patent. A typical little taxpayer, careful to keep his nose clean, asking only to be permitted to tread his narrow path unmolested. Undoubtedly the type who got sick to his stomach at the sight of blood, even though it might be no more than a nosebleed. At 42nd Street, Louis the Goon got off and trundled over to the shuttle. He passed through the Grand Central Station, stopping off to buy a package of Camels en route. The cigar store had a counter display of a bargain buy of razor blades, combined with some unknown brand of shaving cream. Engel hovered over it like a bargain-hunting housewife. The clerk put on his spiel. Engel bought, got stuck for a bottle of aftershave lotion, too. Lamb saw it all from over by the counter of the baggage checking room. A penny saved is a penny earned, he paraphrased for him. They cut through the Gray Bar building to come out on Lexington. Engel proceeded north a few blocks, turned onto one of the commercial hotels noted for its name brand. Halfway across the lobby, a tall, swarthy man with one of those deadpan faces rose to greet him. They shook hands. "You're right on the dot," the tall man said. Engel's pursed mouth lengthened in a flattered smile. "I always make it a point to be punctual." Lamb, dawdling in the background, overheard him say. Then they headed for the elevator bank. The tall one shot 2 glances backward as they did so. Lamb couldn't make it too obvious. When he rounded the corner of the L where the elevators were, they were gone. Lamb went back into the main lobby and ensconced himself behind a morning paper. Midway down the page was more about the threatened strife in the numbers racket. It didn't interest Lamb in the slightest. Engel probably had gone upstairs to try and peddle one of his efficiency schemes to some big shot. The guy he'd met in the lobby was a go-between, doubtlessly. Lamb wondered whether Louis the Goon would get up the nerve to hit his boss for that raise today, as Edie had demanded. Lamb almost lost him. Half an hour later, Louis the Goon came down and scooted out the side entrance in a hurry. When Lamb got out there, his man was already in a cab shooting away. There was something wrong about the conservative, penny-saving Engel taking a taxi. Wilson Lamb did not realize it at the time. They went westward across town. Over near 6th, Lamb's driver lost the other cab. Lamb was cursing when he spotted Engel on the sidewalk, coming back across town. That was strange, because he could have sworn Engel's cab had not stopped. Must have gotten it mixed up with another. Out, he threaded his way recklessly through a welter of vehicles and picked up the tail as his man entered an office building. It was fairly crowded in that foyer, and it was simple to step into the elevator right at Louis the Goon Engel's back. Then wheel behind him, out of sight as he turned. Engel called 14 and got out there. briefcase tightly clutched up under his arm, its flap unbuckled. Going in to high-pressure somebody on a sale, Lamb figured. Another passenger had called 15th, the next floor. Lamb got out there, found the built-in fire escape, and got down to 14. This was a little foolish, he realized. There was no way of finding what office Louis the Goon had visited. Still, he might see him when he came out. Maybe he had gone to see the boss about that raise Edie was demanding. Maybe he'd come out bouncing on his tail feathers. It was fun following and watching Louis the Goon. Like watching an ant on a sidewalk flagstone puttering about its puny business, knowing you were going to stamp out its life when it so pleased you. Lamb was just lighting a cigarette, gazing down the hallway of the 14th floor, when the muffled report came up the staircase. It didn't seem possible. A gun seemed so out of place in such surroundings. Then there were two more shots, a scream intermixed, the shattering of plate glass. Lamb was down the stairs and pulling open the fire door onto the floor below. Immediately he sniffed the acrid fumes of gunpowder. He was looking onto an L of that floor, onto a tableau of violence. There was just a single office suite on that L, directly opposite him. On one of its double doors was lettered Continental Exhibition Corp. The frosted glass of the other door was almost completely broken out, leaving a jagged fringed aperture through which to view the scene within. Wilson Lamb flattered himself on being pretty cool-headed under all circumstances, but he blinked 3 times rapidly now. Inside the Continental Exhibition Corporation, one man was slumped over a desk, an automatic half gripped in his inert hand. He was very dead. Half his head was shot off. Another man was sprawled on the gray broadloom of the reception room, a brownish puddle beneath his side. He wasn't going to be going any place in a hurry either. Even as Lamb stared at the carnage, a third figure appeared, wobbling drunkenly from an inner office. He came stooped over, holding his side, crimson speckled froth at his lips. He got to the shattered glass panel and moved the lips at Wilson Lamb. "Tell him. The police. It was Whisper Ross from the He coughed twice on the Chicago, then caved in on himself and went flat in the hallway. Lamb saw an ashen-faced, bespectacled man peering around the corner of an L. From further back, through an open doorway, a girl's voice was shrieking for the police over the phone. Lamb remembered the fact that he had a gun on his person. It might be extremely embarrassing if the police picked him up for questioning. Ducking back through the fire door, he ran quickly up to the 16th floor, up past the 15th. Nothing had been heard up there yet. He caught a down car and got out just as the first prowl car came sirening its way into the side street curb. Afterward, outside the police cordon thrown around the building, somebody jostled against him, peered under his hat brim. Later, Lamb recalled the bluish scar crescent on his left cheek. "Hey, aren't you Reynolds of the Dispatch, pal?" "Nope," Lamb said. "You're a reporter with one of the local sheets, aren't you?" the other persisted. "I know I've seen you around before." "You must have been wearing your other glasses, bud," Lamb said, and turned away. Maybe it was the effect of seeing the handiwork of that other unknown killer, for the police had nabbed nobody yet in that midtown midday shooting. Anyway, Lamb had the itch to strike. It was like a thirst building in a guy. You've seen somebody else dip into a tall, cool one, and after a while you feel like you've got to have one yourself. Those 3 dead men on the 13th floor of that office building had acted like an aphrodisiac on Wilson Lamb. He wanted to get him his corpse, but soon. He knew it when he picked up his victim again. It was almost 4 p.m., shreds of snow drifting down through New York's early darkness. He was hanging around by the cab stand above 96th on the west side of Broadway, waiting hopefully. He had got so that he felt a little lonely when he didn't have Louis the Goon right handy. He felt on familiar terms with the guy. Of course, Louis the Goon didn't know him. And when he introduced himself, Louis was going to get one hell of a big surprise. Like a kick in the teeth, only a lot more permanent. One of the hackies turned up his radio. A news commentator was on. He came to the topic of the Midtown shooting. 3 dead, gunned in the office of the Continental Exhibition Corporation. Lamb edged over nearer. The Continental outfit, the announcer said, was the business front for one of Big John Gira, well-known local racketeer. Gira was a powerful figure in the Metropolitan Pinball Game Syndicate and had a piece of the number policy racket, too. Police, promising an arrest within 24 hours, claimed the triple killing a step in the fight for control of the numbers game business in this city. They are still seeking the missing Joe the Flasher Abadiro, also reputed to have boasted he would take over the numbers game. 2 of the slain men have been identified as close associates of Big John Gira. A building employee stated earlier today that Gira left the premises less than 5 minutes before the killing. A prominent police official who refused to be quoted asserted the killer was a Chicago torpedo imported for the job. A killer who would not be recognized by members of the New York mobs. We are closing in on him at this very instant, the official concluded. The news broadcaster went on to another item of the day's reports. Lamb turned around, and there was Louis the Goon Engel, not 4 feet away, en route home from the subway. He had paused to listen to the report, too. He stood now with a calculating look, almost as if he were checking the verity of the report. Lamb wanted to laugh in his face. If you'd seen those 3 carcasses leaking blood all over the place, you'd probably have swooned in your britches, my little dope. Lamb addressed him mentally. And the funny part was, the little dope had been so close to it, just a floor away, in fact. As he followed him on uptown, down his side street, Lamb had a curious sense of elation. He was in on the ground floor of Death Incorporated, even before voting at a stockholders' meeting himself, for he knew who had triggered those 3 today. Who the Chi torpedo the cops wanted was. One Whisper Ross. Of course, he might have tipped off the police, say, by a phone call. But he wasn't going to. We killers must stick together. The thought tickled his sense of humor. They were almost at Louis the Goon's roost when Lamb saw how he was going to do it. A boy with a carton of groceries almost ran down Louis, then ducked down into the delivery entrance of the apartment hotel, and Wilson Lamb had his cue. Some 10 minutes later, after due investigation, he knew how he was going to put Louis the Goon on the spot, and how he was going to get away with it, get clear afterward. The taking of life was the important thing. The major premise. Whether he was caught or not had never seemed important before. But after reviewing the handiwork of Whisper Ross, who had ambled off, unimpeded, Lamb saw no reason why he should not do the same. It would be the nth degree in the epitomization of the ego to kill and get away with it. The building's delivery entrance was a perfect avenue of escape. Actually, it did not enter the hotel at first. Down a few steps, and then it ran rearward, between the side of the building and the retaining wall next door, an open-topped alleyway. The delivery doorway was in the rear. A few feet further on was the backyard laid out in a garden with a waterless age-browned concrete fountain in the center. A low concrete wall separated it from the property that backed onto it, and there was the payoff ambling casually through in the darkness. Lamb had discovered that the property in the rear, facing on the next street downtown, was several feet lower. It would be simple to drop over the wall to its paved courtyard, and from that run a concrete passage beside the apartment house out to the street 1 block below. Emerging on it, Lamb lit a cigarette and went back around the block to Engel's place. He appraised it like a surveyor. First off, it was one of those second-rate places that boasted no doorman. Across the street were those brownstones for a nice dim background. The nearest street lamp was down about 10 feet from the entrance of Engel's place. Engel would come walking along primly, right into its light. A man crossing the street from the brownstones, a little behind Engel, calling out, "Hey, Mr. Engel," and it was a very nice setup. The property line of the building where Engel lived was set back several feet further than that of the old-fashioned private homes between it and Broadway. They would serve as a screen for his movements from one direction when he hit onto that delivery alleyway. After fixing Louis the Goon's wagon once and for all, Lamb realized it was almost ridiculously simple. Why, he could almost have chalked an X right there and then on the sidewalk where little Louis would lie down and forget it all. Wilson Lamb hummed as he headed up toward Broadway and decided to have dinner. He had a swell appetite. He was humming snatches from something. Minor key, descending scale. It went, "Come to Papa, come to Papa, come to Papa." He didn't know whether it was from a song or a crap game. Anyway, the dice were sure loaded against a certain party he knew. Down the block, a taxi that had been parked with meter ticking across from Engel's apartment hotel drew away slowly. He went to the movies with Louis the Goon that evening. Louis didn't know anything about it, and Lamb bought his own ticket. That, too, had been extremely simple. After dinner, he had phoned Engel. When Louis himself answered, Lamb had asked for toots. Louis said they had no toots there, and Lamb said he was very sorry, that he must have got the wrong number. And Louis said that was all right, no harm done, and Lamb said he was sorry he had disturbed him, and Louis said to think nothing of it, no trouble at all. And Lamb said a 4-letter word after he had hung up, and laughed out loud in the phone booth. Then he hung around and saw Louis come out after dinner. Edie was with him this time. Edie was the type after which some department store advertising department diplomat had coined the term stylish stout. Edie toddled, and she was pretty hefty. If there was a family argument, Lamb would have laid 2-1 she would have come home in front by a TKO before the 5th round. They went into the movies on the northwest corner of 96th. The closest Lamb could get was some 3 rows back. He was disappointed because he could not watch Engel's face. It was a double feature. Pompous Nights was one of those alleged South American musicals whipped up by a couple of sub-morons with the intent purpose of sabotaging the good neighbor policy. The other picture was some ghoulish thing about a mad surgeon, described in the script as an egomaniac, who had a pleasant pastime of revivifying electrocuted felons. That one gave Lamb a pain in the pants, too. He had really made a study of egomaniacs. He got out in the foyer right behind the Engels. He heard Edie say she thought the one about that nutty doc was so thrilling. Louis the Goon did not agree. He liked those musicals. "They take my mind off business," he said. Lamb left them and went in and had a drink. He had 2 drinks. Now that everything was settled, he felt no impatience. It was all lined up right down to the final curtain. Louis's final curtain. Lamb had already decided he would give it to him as he came plodding his smug little way home some evening. Any evening. Maybe tomorrow evening. Now that the details were ironed out, it was fun to leave the closing date open. He could play the fly on the wall in Louis the Goon's life as long as he wanted. And when he got bored with Louis's act, bop, he would deliver his compact little package to Louis. He started to get bored fast the next day. He rode downtown with Louis, and they went over to that same East Side hotel. And Louis went upstairs. He was gone a long time. Lamb said to himself, "That dope goes around in a rut, and I'll get in one, too, just following him, and then I will get sore." Eventually, Louis the Goon came back down into the lobby. The tall, swarthy man he had met there the day before was with him. "Well, I guess there'll be nothing doing today," Louis the Goon said. "Nope, nothing," the other said. They parted. Louis went down to the telephones, used one after consulting a little black book. When he came out, he bought a white carnation for his buttonhole in the florist shop, then treated himself to 3 25-center perfectos. Something builds, Lamb told himself. Outside, when Louis the Goon got a taxi, there was something positively cocky about him. Lamb was humming his Come to Papa again as he took another and trailed him eastward this time. Louis got out at a 3rd Avenue bar and grill and went in. Lamb gave him 5 minutes and straight in himself. There was no Louis. Not at first, anyway. Lamb could feel his pulse beat faster. Then he spotted the dim back room with the booths, and he went through it to the men's room. And there was Louis the Goon, his little clay pigeon, in one of the booths with a doll. She was red-haired by courtesy of the local beauty parlor, cuddling up in a flashy little leopard fur number. She looked like a dance hall hostess from one of the joints where everything goes so long as you keep time to the music. As Lamb passed, she was saying, "Now, Daddy," that almost unbuttoned Lamb. Daddy? On his way back, he noticed there were 2 others in the back room, a couple of men gnawing on pretzels over beers. He stepped back into the bar just in time. 3 men had entered. They headed straight for the rear. One of them shouldered Wilson Lamb from his path as if he did not see him. The second one pulled out a cannon and poked it at the bartender and told him to keep his britches on. Then the other 2 were in the rear and let him go with their cannon. Slammed over against the bar, Lamb had a split-second glimpse of it. For a moment, it almost seemed as if the damn fools were out after Engel. One shot smashed the table lamp in the booth where he sat. Then the 2 beer drinkers back in there were around and swapping it out with cannon of their own with the newcomers. Lamb got out of there fast. He got across the street. He saw 2 men dash out of a side entrance and into a dark sedan that roared away. He did not see Louis the Goon get out. Then the howling prowl cars converged on the scene, and there was an ambulance. It took 1 guy away. Another guy, it didn't. Lamb worked his way up into the throng and got a glimpse of the other guy, getting stiff on the backroom floor. Everybody else was lined up in the bar for questioning. Engel was not among them. So Lamb knew he must have gotten away all right. "This is some more of that numbers racket war," a gray-haired sergeant said. And then Lamb began to taste something like panic, even as the first neon signs began to smear the wintry shadows. He got afraid he might lose his little clay pigeon. Louis the Goon seemed to have a blind genius for getting on the scene when some bloodletting was due. He felt a certain possessiveness towards Louis. Louis belonged to him, and he wasn't going to have him chopped down by any piece of stray lead. Lamb had a bullet earmarked for Louis. He said, "I've been wasting time." He got on the shuttle and over to the west side and up to 96th and across the street from where Louis lived. Well, where Louis used to live, anyway. He was there just 20 minutes. It was 4:43 by his wristwatch when Louis the Goon came down from the corner. He couldn't make out his face at first, but he knew him by that square-set hat. Lamb eased away from the stairs of the brownstone, humming, "Come to Papa, come to Papa, come to Papa." This was it, the ultimate in the demonstration of the ego. He told himself that as he moved over the scabrous snow of the street. The zenith in the projection of the psyche. Louis the Goon had his briefcase clutched up under one arm instead of swinging. The final triumph over the fear trauma. Louis was abreast of him, then passing by. Wilson Lamb brought the automatic out from under his coat. He called, "Mr. Engel." And Louis the Goon turned, and Lamb held it, wanting him to get a good look at the heater, wanting to get a good look at him as he saw it. Engel had the briefcase open, unbuckled. He was bringing something out of it, swiftly, jerkily. It was a heater, too. That wasn't in the script. Louis the Goon was stepping out of role, but Lamb knew he had him anyway, and started to squeeze. He would squeeze 3 times on that trigger, and somebody else squeezed first. It was the man running from that parked car down the street. Lamb got it in the side, and then a red-hot finger was probing down into his guts. A man stepped from the vestibule of one of those brownstones, and he squeezed, and Wilson Lamb couldn't feel the side of his head anymore. Knew he would never feel it again. He was down on one hand and one knee, and his gun was gone. Someplace in the black haze seething around him. Like a hurt animal, half crawling, knowing only the base instinct of self-preservation, he tried for that delivery alleyway. Somebody else had figured that was a good spot, too. It was the man with the bluish cheek scar who had accosted him after the triple killing in that office building. He squeezed. And Lamb took that one square in the chest. In a vague way, as the sidewalk slid up at him, he was aware of that car backfiring away like hell. The man with the blue scar was standing over him, throwing words to Louis the Goon in a quick, harsh whisper. "This is the one, Whisper. He came in here with you Wednesday. He was on the spot when you gave it to them boys in Gear's office yesterday. Today, he was in that bar when they tried to get you. The flasher said to stick close to you and him." "Gear's finger man, eh?" called back Engel softly. "Yeah, Whisper." The blue-scarred man ran. In a moment, a car roared off down the block toward West End Avenue. Lying there on the sidewalk, blasted for keeps, his wagon fixed, Wilson Lamb tried to put it together. Things moved very slowly for him. Whisper Ross, Jai Torpedo. Then he had it. Whisper Ross was Louis the Goon Engel, hired killer of Joe the Flasher Abadiro, the guy he, Wilson Lamb, had fingered for an exposition of his ego. Down the sidewalk, little Mr. Louis Engel, alias Whisper Ross, stood looking at the body and going tisk tisk through pursed lips. Wilson Lamb's ego died a horrible death 17 seconds before he did. End of Candidate for a Coffin. Story number 2 of Hooded Detective, 6 Pulp Detective Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dan Grzinski. Hooded Detective, 6 Pulp Detective Stories. Story number 2. $100 per stiff, by J. Lloyd Conrich. "There's a guy outside wants to see you, Chief," Charlie Ward's assistant announced through the door. "What's he want, Joe?" "I don't know. Says his business is confidential and urgent. Wouldn't say what. Looks harmless, though, in spite of he drove up in a Rolls Royce with a chauffeur." "Well, send him in." Ward busied himself with a sheaf of morning mail and miscellaneous police circulars. Presently, a small, immaculate-looking individual with an apologetic, breathless air entered the room and approached the desk timidly. Silently, without even so much as a nod, he laid a newspaper clipping before the chief of police. Adjusting his glasses, Ward reached for the item and glanced through it hastily. "Man killed at El Gatos grade crossing. El Gatos, November 1. The decapitated body of a man tentatively identified as J. Peter Peck, address unknown, was discovered by a company track walker early this morning on the Southwest Pacific grade crossing half a mile south of the town of El Gatos. Local police believe that the man was killed sometime after midnight, possibly by the San Francisco milk train. Identification was established by a wallet containing papers of the deceased. Ward laid the clipping on his desk, rolled a bulbous wad of chewing tobacco into one cheek, and expelled it into a spittoon some 10 feet away with a resounding plunk. Wiping his chin inexpertly with the back of a grizzled hand, he looked up and eyed his visitor interrogatively. "I clipped it from last night's San Francisco Bulletin," the latter explained quietly. "I drove practically all night so as to be here this morning." "You're a relative?" The stranger smiled weakly and placed a pair of painfully thin hands on the desk as though to steady himself. Well, no, not exactly. That is, somewhat, he answered obscurely. Charlie Ward eyed the little man curiously. Come again, please? Well, it's this way, slipping nervously to the very edge of a convenient chair. There appears to have been a slight error made. The clipping is somewhat inaccurate. Sure, half the stuff you see in the papers these days is cockeyed. Them guys never get anything straight. I always tell my wife you gotta believe only 10% of what you read and doubt that. The stranger smiled thinly. Precisely. Now, the real truth of the matter in this particular case is that I happen to be J. Peter Peck, and to the best of my knowledge, I'm not dead. In fact, I'd take issue with anyone who questioned the fact. I therefore feel that the report has been exaggerated, just a tiny bit at least. He paused for breath. I thought you'd like to know. Ward arched his brows and smiled calmly. As a veteran police officer, he was used to surprises. Well, now that's one for the book, ain't it? Rather. So if you're the guy that's supposed to be downstairs on ice, Ward supplemented, fumbling in a drawer of his desk, how can we find this here wallet with your name all over the papers inside on him? Mr. Peck glanced at the wallet. Very easily explained, he answered. I was held up last Monday evening in San Francisco. The wallet and the papers it contains were among things taken from me. Incidentally, there were several thousands of dollars in the wallet when I last saw it. Ward whistled softly. How much? About $2,400. That's a lot of dollars. It would keep a man in cigars for a day or two. And this guy, after he stuck you up, Ward reasoned, left Frisco and came north, where he had the bad luck to meet with an accident. Precisely. What did he look like? There were two of them. One had red hair, and his left ear was missing. The other was short, about my size, I would say, rather thin, with a small, black, scraggly mustache and swarthy skin. I should judge he were either Italian or possibly a Spaniard. The second one fits the guy on ice. Want to take a squint at him? Mr. Peck jumped to his feet. I'd be delighted, he said with what sounded to Charlie like unwarranted glee. Ward picked up a flask of corn whiskey and slipped it into his hip pocket. I warn you, he cautioned as he rose, this guy is pretty much worked over in spots. A train went through him, you know. Some people get goose pimples looking at them kinds of things. I'll risk it. The pair left the office and descended a flight of steps. At the end of a dark corridor, Ward led the way into a basement room. Upon one of two marble slabs in the center of the room lay a sheeted corpse. Ward pulled the shroud back, revealing a horribly mangled body. Mr. Peck leaned over the corpse, revealing none of the repulsion that Ward was sure he would exhibit. Yes, that's unquestionably one of the men who held me up, the little man said quietly. I'd know that face anywhere, what there is left of it. Seems to be quite dead, doesn't he? He added wryly. Quite, Ward mimicked, wondering at the same time what strange complex could cause a man of Mr. Peck's evident refinement and good breeding to jest under such circumstances. The little man leaned over the corpse again. Odd marks on his face, aren't they? He observed. Huh? Ward seemed startled. I said those were odd marks on his face, Mr. Peck repeated. Ward's face clouded, and he stepped closer to Mr. Peck. It's funny you should notice them red blotches, Mr. Peck, he said. I've been kind of wondering about them myself. The two men eyed one another for a moment of tense silence and marked suspicion. Why? Mr. Peck asked abruptly. Ward scanned the little man's face with an air of uncertainty. Do them marks mean anything to you? He finally asked, his voice tinged with caution. Mr. Peck made no immediate answer, but turned and leaned closer to the corpse, examining the faint red blotches on the cheeks with more care than he had at first taken. To the casual observer, that is, to the layman, he said, removing his glasses and facing Ward, it might appear that the deceased was suffering from a mild case of measles. He paused, glanced at the corpse again, and then turned once more to Ward. But to the trained eye, I would say that this man has received a shot of xetholine caniopus into his system. A shot of what? The name means little. Xetholine caniopus is a drug. Not rare, not common, but violently poisonous. Contact even to the lips or to a flesh abrasion will bring about practically instantaneous paralysis of the cardia. The little man blinked. The heart, I refer to. Xetholine invariably leaves its mark, as you perceive, in the form of faint red blotches on the cheeks. He thumbed in the direction of the corpse. Putting the diagnosis into simpler words, this man has been poisoned. He died from the effects of the poison, as is indicated by the slight carmine tinge to the blood. The effect of this poison on the bloodstream is similar to that caused by asphyxiation by coal gas or a similar substance, only not quite so brilliantly red. If this man had died as a direct result of injuries received by the train passing over his body, the blood would be darker, almost purple. Offhand, I would say that the train passed over his body some several hours after his death. Depending upon the determination as to whether the poison was self-administered or otherwise, will settle the question as to whether you have a suicide or a murder case on your hands. Ward stared into the little man's eyes in astonishment. "Say," he interrupted, "who are you, anyhow?" Mr. Peck smiled benevolently. "My name," he explained, "you already know. I happen to be deeply interested in criminology. It's been an avocation of mine for many years. My specialty is toxicology. Toxicology, the study of poisons. The circumstances of this particular case are unusually close to home, and I feel a personal interest." He paused and peered into Ward's face hesitantly, and then added in a voice that half pleaded and half apologized, would you allow me to work with you in this matter, Mr. Ward? I'd expect no pay, of course," he hastened to add, "and I can assure you that my efforts will be sincere and my intentions entirely honorable. My only interest is in clearing up the matter, or at least attempting to do so for the fun of doing it." "Some fun, all right," Ward observed wryly. "But at that price, the county can't lose much. You're hired." "That's fine," Mr. Peck enthused, his eyes shining brilliantly. He rubbed his palms together briskly. "I can't tell you how deeply grateful I really am." "Okay, Mr. Peck," with a shade of doubt. "It's your funeral. The paper says so. Now, first, I must make a test to satisfy myself that xetholine caniopus was the actual cause of death. There are a few things I'll need. A glass, an ordinary water glass will do, a small quantity of commercial alcohol, and a bit of lime water. My chauffeur will get the latter too. If you'll supply the glass, please notify him." Ward hesitated, as though doubtful about leaving this unusual person alone in the morgue, but finally assented. A few minutes later he reappeared with the glass, followed almost directly by the chauffeur with the alcohol and lime water. "Thank you, Christian," Mr. Peck said in the chauffeur's direction. "You may wait in the car." Ward's eyes followed the chauffeur as he left the room. "He's a big guy, all right," he observed, thumbing toward the vanishing driver. "Sure must have had his mush every morning when he was a little boy. Looks like he's about 6'6". 6'6" 1/8" in his stocking feet, to be exact," Mr. Peck corrected. "Before meals he weighs 288. After meals, 298. Wouldn't want to run into him on a dark night. Hardly, Mr. Peck agreed. When he first came to me, he applied for the position which he now holds under the name of Mike Dennis, and explained that he generally answered to the intimate and thoroughly quaint cognomen of Butch. But I changed that to Christian. Of course, Butch is more in keeping, but I do believe that Christian adds to his dignity, in spite of his ears. Don't you think so? Ward grunted vaguely. I have it on good authority that he put Mr. Dempsey to sleep one evening about 15 years ago in an amateur boxing meet. Mr. Peck's eyes sparkled as he glanced up from his work for a moment. Unfortunately, I happen to be worth several $1,000,000. There have been 2 attempts to abduct me. Christian makes an excellent bodyguard, as well as chauffeur. Not much intellect, but most conscientious and as faithful as an old watchdog. I've had him with me 22 months now, and to date he's uttered not more than 22 words, except, of course, when I speak with him. A handy person to have about, most handy. By now Mr. Peck had sterilized the glass with the alcohol and was prepared to make his test. In the glass, he explained, holding an object toward the light, I have poured some lime water. By blowing one's breath into the liquid through a common cigarette holder, the lime water becomes milky white, thusly, and he suited the action to the word. The balance of the test is quite simple. Several drops of the deceased's coagulated blood are now added to the water. As you see, there is no change. In a moment I will add a little alcohol. If the lime water clears and becomes colorless again, and shows indication of a volatile oil on the surface, you may rest assured that xetholine caniopus exists in the bloodstream. Although the test is simple, the chemical reaction is rather involved, being a combination and then a dissemination of structural heratexe and third power fincus. I shall not, therefore, bother you with its details. Suffice to say, the test is infallible and conclusive. Ward scratched his head in hopeless perplexity and stared in mild anticipation, mingled with a great deal of skepticism, as Mr. Peck poured a small quantity of alcohol into the glass. Immediately the liquid became pure and colorless, and the surface indicated a distinctly oily film. All of which bears me out, Mr. Peck said quietly, placing the glass on the table. This man has been poisoned. Our next step is to determine whether the poison was self-administered or otherwise. Just a minute, Mr. Peck, Ward interrupted, raising his hand. There's a couple of things here I ought to explain. Ward floundered for a moment of hesitancy. You see, it's this way. For about 20 years now, about 12 people a year have died in this here town. 1 a month, that's the average. Yes? Mr. Peck interjected interestedly. But in the last month, 11 people have turned in their rain checks. This guy's the 12th, which more or less upsets the law of averages. That's just what I'm getting at. But what's worse is that 10 out of these 12 met with deaths from accidents of one kind or another. Just how do you mean? Well, this guy, for instance, motioning towards the slab, was bumped by a train. The rest met with other accidents ranging all the way from hit and run down the line to falling off hay lofts and being kicked in the head by a mule. Nobody's seen any of the accidents, but the evidence was such that you couldn't help see what happened. For instance, the guy that was kicked by a mule, he had a hoof mark on his head, and his mule had a bloody hoof. The hit-run guy we found in the middle of the highway. Coincidence. Accidents almost invariably occur in 3s or 4s. Sure, 3s and 4s, but not 10s and 12s. But there's something else. Yes? Charlie Ward moved a little closer and glanced behind him as he spoke. Of the 10 who met with accidents, he said, 9 had these red marks on their cheeks. Excellent! Gorgeous! Mr. Peck enthused through grinning lips. A multiple murder! Nothing could be clearer or more fortunate. Well, you may be tickled, Mr. Peck, but I ain't. Several of the victims were close friends of mine. Mr. Peck's attitude changed at once. I'm deeply sorry, Mr. Ward, he apologized. My enthusiasm carried me away for the moment. Please proceed. Ward nodded and went on. At first, I didn't think very much about these blotches, but when this guy was brought in this morning, I began to get kind of nervous. As a matter of fact, I was just going to phone Frisco for help when you came in. Mr. Peck nodded and smacked his lips thoughtfully. He removed his glasses and wiped them slowly and carefully, polishing each lens with meticulous care. You, of course, have a coroner or medical examiner of some kind, he finally said. Oh, sure. Old Doc Kraus handles the cases for the whole county when they come up. There ain't enough to keep him on full time, but we send for him whenever we need him. He makes the examination and runs the inquest. What did he think about the red blotches on the faces of the 9 corpses? Nothing. To tell you the truth, I never thought enough about them to bring it up. And he's never mentioned it to you? No. I can't possibly conceive of anyone missing them. The doc's getting pretty old, Ward explained. He don't see so good. We've been trying to get a younger Sawbones for a long time, but nobody had the guts to tell him he was fired, I guess. He was born here, lived here for 72 years. He's a nice enough old guy. Matter of fact, everybody sort of looks up to him as the town granddad. He's a kindly old duffer, always doing things for folks and going out of his way to help a neighbor and things like that. I'll send for him and ask him if he noticed the marks and what he thinks about them. No, I'd prefer it if you didn't. For the present, let's work quietly. As far as I'm concerned, everybody's under suspicion, and any word getting out that we're working on the case might spoil things. Old Doc Kraus under suspicion? Ward scoffed with a loud guffaw. Say, that's rich. Why, I'd trust him ahead of my own dad, and that's saying a lot. Why, he brought me into this world 42 years ago. Used to spank me when I was a kid and needed one. Why, I did not say I suspected Dr. Kraus, Mr. Peck interrupted. I merely inferred that everybody was under suspicion until we begin to find something definite to go on. The reasons, I believe, are obvious. I get you, Mr. Peck. Now then, the inquest has been performed in this last case? Yes, early this morning, just before you got here. They handed down a verdict of accidental death. Have you made any attempts to identify the corpse? Certainly. We figured it was you on account of the papers. We've been trying to trace you through the Frisco police. So far, no information has come in. That's quite possible. I lead a very quiet life. Live at a bachelor club, and I'm not listed either in the phone book or the city directory. I sent fingerprints to the Frisco police. If this guy's got a record, we'll know who he is pretty quick. That's fine. Mr. Peck stood for a moment with a thoughtful finger to his lips. I think we'll visit the spot where the body was discovered, he decided abruptly. We can go in my car. 10 minutes later, J. Peter Peck, accompanied by Charlie Ward and followed by Kristin, stepped from the machine at a point opposite the spot where the body had been found. A machine has stopped here at the side of the road quite recently, Mr. Peck offered, pointing to the tire marks in the dust. The occupant, as is indicated by those very clear footprints, stepped from the car, crossed the ditch, and walked to the railroad tracks. He was a heavy man, at that, or at least he has big feet, and they turn out more than the feet of the average person. Charlie Ward nodded in agreement. Now, if you'll look closely, Mr. Peck went on, you will observe that there are 2 sets of footprints, one coming and one going. The return prints, significantly, are not as clear as those that go to the tracks, indicating that he was carrying a load to the tracks, but did not return with it. He glanced at Ward for a moment, then added, It is pretty obvious what that load was, all of which gives us practically undeniable proof that a murder was committed. The deceased died of poison. We have definitely established that point. And his body was placed upon the tracks to conceal the fact, or to attempt to do so. If the deceased had walked to the tracks himself, which of course he didn't, because these are not his footprints, there obviously would be no return prints. Dead men, especially decapitated dead men, seldom if ever retrace their steps. He paused for a moment of conjecture. We'll take plaster casts of the footprints as well as the tire marks. Will you attend to that, Kristin? I believe you'll find sufficient plaster of Paris in the tool compartment. Kristin set to work, and Mr. Peck and Ward retreated to the machine. When Kristin had completed his work, the trio returned to headquarters, Mr. Peck leaving again to do a little thinking. 2 hours later, Mr. Peck entered Charlie Ward's office again and eased himself into a chair. I have an idea, he informed Ward, that the apprehension of the murderer is but a matter of moments. As a matter of fact, I can put my finger on him in 10 minutes, should I care to. You can put your finger on him right this minute if you want to, Ward supplemented, taking his feet off the desk and flipping a cigarette butt through the window. How so? Ward unlocked a drawer on his desk and drew out a tin box, from which he produced a thickly padded envelope. I've been doing a little scientific snooping myself, he announced, with a proud ear-to-ear grin. That's extremely gratifying. Ward thumbed toward a cigar butt in an ashtray. That, he said, is what's left of a cigar you gave me this morning. It gives off a pretty thick aroma. It ought to. They cost me $1 each. Just take a whiff of this, Ward said, handing the envelope to Mr. Peck. The latter smelled cautiously. Why, it smells like my cigars. Exactly. Now take a squint in the envelope. Mr. Peck opened the envelope and extracted a sheaf of currency. There's about 24 grand there, Ward offered. All of which is mine. It's the money that was taken from me when I was held up. I had the wallet and several of the cigars in the same pocket. The currency evidently became impregnated with the odor of the cigars. Where did you get it? Ward shuffled leisurely through some papers, finally producing a telegram. This wire, he said, flourishing the message with an extravagant gesture, come in from the Frisco police while you were out. It says the guy downstairs on ice is Dominic Diaz. He was a guest at San Quentin up to 4 days ago, where he was serving 10 to 50 years for some mistakes he made when he was younger. Mr. Peck nodded interestedly. It also says that when he so rudely walked off the premises without stopping to say goodbye, he was with a red-headed monkey, minus one ear. That answers to the name of Mike McSweeney. I see. Mr. McSweeney had the bad taste to try to stick up our local drug emporium about half an hour ago, and he is now incarcerated in your Bastille? Right. And he had your dough on him. Ward sat back in his swivel chair, hooked his thumbs into the armholes of his vest, and beamed. Well, I guess that makes it pretty clear, eh, Mr. Peck? Diaz, the dead pigeon, and this guy McSweeney take it on to lamb from the big house. They sticks you up, then blow north and land here. They're going to split, but McSweeney's a pig. He wants the works, so what does he do? He croaks his pal. Ward cocked his head and extended his hands, palms outwards. Okay. Mr. Peck scratched his chin thoughtfully. Well, fairly so, he answered without enthusiasm, but before I say how clear, I'd like to see this McSweeney person. A moment later, a very sullen and defiant Mike McSweeney was ushered into the room. Turn around slowly, Mr. Peck ordered. The man sulked, but with a little persuasion he finally did as he was told. Now take your shoes off. Say, what is this, a racket? The prisoner snarled. That will be all, Mr. Peck murmured after a hasty inspection of McSweeney's feet. You may return him to his cell, and unless you care to have him prosecuted for his attempted robbery of the drugstore, you may just as well notify the warden at San Quentin to come and get him. His list of crimes, I'm sorry to say, Ward, does not include the murder of Dominic Diaz. Why, it's as plain as the nose on your face, Ward sputtered as McSweeney was led from the room. The cigar-smelling currency. You've tried hard, Mr. Peck interrupted. Very hard, in fact. Your efforts are indeed commendable, and I do say that your deductions are plausible. But the fact remains that McSweeney is not the man we are looking for. Well, couldn't have McSweeney poisoned him and then thrown his body on the tracks? He could have, Mr. Peck conceded, but there would be no object in attempting to conceal his method of killing his confederate. Besides, he is not mentally equipped to think of such things. Offhand, I'd say that his IQ is that of an 8-year-old boy. Remember also that we are looking for a man, or possibly a woman, who has killed several persons within the past 30 days using the same method, that of the injection of xethylene caniopus. McSweeney couldn't have killed any of the others for the very simple reason that he was behind bars up to 4 days ago. Mr. Peck raised his hand to silence Ward. In addition, Mr. Ward, please remember that I have a motor car full of footprint casts. Even in his bare feet, which you saw with your own eyes, he'd overlap those prints a half-inch all around. That's why I had his shoes removed. Also, you recall that the man who carried Diaz's body to the railroad tracks possessed feet that pointed outward. McSweeney is decidedly pigeon-toed. Mr. Peck raised his hands, palms outward, and then dropped them to his chubby knees with a sharp slap. Now, how clear does your case appear? Ward grunted and stared out of the window. On the other hand, Mr. Ward, as I before stated and now repeat, I can put my finger on the murderer within 10 minutes, should I care to. Who is it? I'll tell you later. There are 1 or 2 points I must clear up before I order the arrest. I'd like to drop in and have a talk with Dr. Krauss first. I believe he can furnish what little information I require. This is Mr. Peck, Dr. Krauss, Ward said as the pair entered the doctor's study 10 minutes later. It's a pleasure, Mr. Peck conceded coolly. He drew a newspaper clipping from his pocket and handed it to Dr. Krauss. To settle an argument, would you read this and give me your opinion? The doctor read the clipping through hastily. Why, trepanning is nothing new, he scoffed. The ancient Egyptians practiced it successfully 5,000 years ago. They— Never mind, Mr. Peck interrupted sharply. I don't care a rap if the practice is new or old. He glanced sharply at Ward, who stood gaping in astonishment, then back at the doctor. The point is, Dr. Krauss, how does it happen that you were able to read fine newsprint, and yet while performing autopsies on 9 different corpses, you missed the fact that each of these persons had died from a shot of xethylene caniopus, as was clearly indicated by the red blotches on the face of each individual victim? Dr. Krauss stiffened and stared at his inquisitor with cold precision. I'm afraid I don't quite follow you, Mr. Peck, he said smoothly. That likewise makes little difference. I also note that your toes point out considerably more than the toes of the average person. Your remark, Mr. Peck, is not alone vague, but makes no sense. At least not to me. Ward intervened with a snort. You're crazy, Peck, he asserted heatedly. I tell you, I've known Dr. Krauss all my life. I'll vouch for him. Mr. Peck silenced Ward with an impatient gesture. Then, turning again to Dr. Krauss, he said slowly and clearly, enunciating each word with care and precision, "There has been a murder committed, Dr. Krauss. As a matter of fact, there have been several murders, but I refer to one in particular, that of one Dominic Diaz, an escaped convict. Diaz died from xethylene caniopus poisoning. Later, his body was placed on the railroad tracks to make it appear that he had been killed by a train and to conceal the fact that he had been poisoned." "Yes, I'm aware of the incident," Dr. Krauss answered evenly. "I performed the autopsy, but—" "And you also murdered this man, Dr. Krauss." Mr. Peck glared into the doctor's eyes as he shot the accusation. The old man sucked in a great breath and fell back a step, and Ward saw to his deep consternation that the kindly light that had shone in Dr. Krauss's eyes for many a year was no longer there. "The tire marks that we found on the road near the scene of the train accident, Dr. Krauss," Mr. Peck continued, "were made by your car. In addition, Dr. Krauss, the poison was administered most carefully and professionally with a hypodermic needle. Only a physician or one skilled in the use of such an instrument could so inject a poison as delicate and as deadly as xethylene caniopus. Obviously, because of the fact that you yourself were the autopsy surgeon, and because no other person in the county is familiar with such matters, you estimated your chances of detection as being extremely small. But—" Mr. Peck hesitated for a split fraction of a second. "Drop that!" he shouted, pouncing upon the aged physician and slapping a small glass vial from his hand. But his action was just an instant too late. For the next moment, the old man slumped to the floor. Through eyes already dimmed by the instant action of the deadly poison, he peered up at Ward. I'm sorry, Charlie," he breathed softly as Ward dropped to his side. "After all these years, I've brought disgrace to our midst." Ward, panic-stricken and terrified, looked up at Mr. Peck, who stood frowning down at the pair. "There's nothing we can do, Ward," he said quietly. "Look closely. The red blotches are already forming on his cheeks. Just hold him another 10 seconds." Presently, Ward settled the body of the old man back to the floor. Then he rose and faced Mr. Peck. "I can't believe it," he murmured, looking away. "I just can't believe it. I can't see why he should have done it. There wasn't any reason for it." "Ah, but there was a reason for it," Mr. Peck asserted confidently. "Through various channels I discovered this morning that Dr. Krauss was deeply involved financially. His circumstances were desperate. It was vitally important that he raise $2,000 at once." "But I can't see how his killing anybody could have brought him any money. You forget, Mr. Ward," Mr. Peck elucidated with a wry smile, "that Dr. Krauss was not a permanent employee of the county. He was retained as needed to perform an autopsy and preside at the inquest. For these services, he was paid at the rate of $100 a case. 12 inquests at $100 each comes to $1,200, or at least it did when I studied mathematics as a small boy. Now, Mr. Ward, is the motive clear?" Ward nodded. "The doctor needed $800 more," Mr. Peck concluded, "but for a strange set of circumstances which brought me here, you, Mr. Ward, might have been his next victim." "And of $100 per stiff."
Story 3 of Hooded Detective, 6 Pulp Detective Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hooded Detective, 6 Pulp Detective Stories. Story 3, Death is Deaf. by Cliff Campbell. Big Sid couldn't understand it, and he was a smart monkey. He had cased this job himself, personal, had cooked up the scheme for pulling it off, had spent a good 2 weeks laying the groundwork. Nobody yet had ever called Big Sid Cloris a dummy, either. Yet here he was, locked up in their tin can of a jail as good as a dead duck. He couldn't understand it. It couldn't be. Not for him, Big Sid. Yet the bars of that cell door were chrome steel, not papier-mâché. And those birds chatting down the hall were local coppers with a couple of men from the county homicide squad. And an escort of state troopers were en route to take him over to the real clink at the county seat. It couldn't happen to him, Big Sid. But it had. And it was going to be for murder, maybe. "Sid! Sid!" said Johnny the Itch, almost reverently. He always addressed Big Sid that way. He said, "Sid, I think maybe I got something figured. But how did it happen, Sid?" "Shut up," said Big Sid with a disgusted glance over his thick shoulder. He didn't bother really looking at him. Nobody much ever bothered looking at Johnny the Itch. He was one of those little insignificant hangdog things with vacant eyes, round-shouldered, the kind they turn off the assembly line to hold up the fronts of pool parlors. He had that twitching muscle in his right cheek. It made the skin jerk and pull as if he were trying to get rid of an itch without using his hand. He could do one thing. He could tool a heap like a maniacal genius born with a steering wheel in his hands. "Shut up." Big Sid grunted his way again and walked past the bowl in the corner of the cell. He was trying to figure this out. He stood there, winding the tail of his necktie around a big finger. Johnny the Itch pulled nervously at the wide-brimmed fedora jerked down on his bony skull. "But, Sid, I think I got a way to—" Big Sid turned around, spat out his cigarette, heeled it into the concrete. He didn't take his eyes off Johnny the Itch for a long moment. They were big, muddy eyes, protruding. When Big Sid looked at you that way, a guy felt he was being measured for a casket. Big Sid could haul off and belt your teeth down your throat with those tremendous arms of his, and those eyes would never change. He really wasn't a tall or unusually large man, Big Sid, but he was solid beef. That big belly that filled out a double-breasted drum tight, the massive shoulders that started, minus courtesy of neck, from right beneath his double chin, the big, wide-nostriled nose that gave him a certain kind of heavy dignity. He exuded bigness. Johnny the Itch fingered away sweat that rolled down from under his fedora and nodded obediently. He felt of the fedora gingerly as Big Sid turned away. Big Sid was thinking and had to be let alone. When Big Sid thought, it was real important. Later, he'd tell him. Big Sid sweated and listened to the buzz of voices from down the corridor and tried not to believe he might have signed his own death warrant. He put his hands on his broad hips, ignoring the bandaged wrist where that copper's bullet had got him. He went back to the beginning. It had been such a sweet setup. This dinky little whistle-stop of a town, Duffyville, over near the southwestern border of the state, with its single bank, the Duffyville National, and that motor parts plant on the outskirt with its heavy backlog of defense orders that had compelled a doubling of its help, a consequent raise in its payroll, too, and that payroll moved through the bank, naturally. Just a little matter of something over $21,000 each week. "It's a shame to take it," Big Sid had said at the beginning. Then he had cased it thoroughly, and he had moved into town openly and above board, registered at the little hotel as one Samuel Norris. Big front with plenty of credentials and a neat black mustache which could be shaved off easily enough later. Then he had walked right into that bank and identified himself, even opened up a small checking account, just for ready cash, of course. That was the way he did things, cool and nervy, always thinking ahead. He was a smart guy. Sure, maybe you could grab that dough by blasting your way with the heaters plenty, but that kind of stuff only made you hot as hell afterward. You had to keep lambing, and maybe you never got a chance to enjoy it. Big Sid wasn't dumb like that. His way, it had been a cinch to get the whole layout. how the payroll cash was brought from up the line in an armored car to the bank before opening time in the morning, and the company guards came down and picked it up immediately after lunch for their auditing department. After lunch. He had put his finger on that weak spot almost from the start. The quiet lunch hour in a sleepy little town. When two of the tellers and the bank officers went home to eat the way they did in those Hickbergs, that was the time for the snatch. And even that was not to be done crudely, not Big Sid's way. He was pretty well known in the Duffyville National by then. Been dropping in to confer with the vice president about the local real estate situation. It was so simple. A few hints dropped about the possible establishment of a new branch plant. Of course, a man wasn't always free to mention in advance whom he represented. And they'd have to get definite word about the extension of a railroad siding for the lading purposes, too. Oh, it went over big. He knew how they did things in that bank, and he made them feel that they knew him, which was very important. Especially that teller down at the end window, Eklund, the one who stayed when the others went out to eat at the noon hour. Eklund was sort of good-looking in a weak, blonde way. He studied accounting at night. Samuel Norris said he might know of an opening for a bright young fellow there. When he came up to the city, they'd have to get together. Least he could do would be to show him around the hot spots some night. That always made Eklund flush some. You could see he was the type who dreamed of himself as a glamour boy, a killer-diller with the dames. And there was that fallen-arched Paddy who was the guard. Nice and simple. An occasional cigar, a friendly slap on the back did for him. So there she was. Perfect. The clincher was to get away without firing a shot. Before there was a warning. No shooting, and they would be miles away before they stopped rubbing their eyes in that one water tank berg. Probably wouldn't have figured out exactly what had happened until sometime Saturday, and the payroll came in on Friday. They scoured every main artery and side road and cart track for miles in every direction, he and Johnny the Itch. They figured on cutoffs in case of a chase and how they could double in their tracks, and the pass over the mountain ridge that would take them across the state line. And about 40 miles down the line, on that abandoned farm, they located the old barn where they would switch cars. They would hide the second heap in the barn. Williams would take care of that. He was the trigger man. Sonny Williams, cool as ice behind the business end of a Tommy gun. Now, Sonny Williams was Sid, Johnny the Itch said, watching the cell door nervously. He couldn't keep the whimper out of his voice. Sid, time's getting short. I think I got a way. A chance for us, anyways. I got something. His whisper cracked, and he made a faint gesture toward his fedora as if he feared the walls had eyes as well as ears. He was scared as hell. It made Big Sid sick. The little rat didn't have anything to be scared about, not like he did. He glared at him. I'm thinking, he warned heavily. Johnny the Itch nodded so his under jaw jiggled. When a phone jangled down the corridor, his eyes bugged right at the door. Then he couldn't stand it any longer. Look, Sid, how did it happen? You're smart. You figured it all out, and... He half choked and had to dredge his voice up out of his throat again. He took his hat carefully by both hands. Look, Sid, I got... But Sid took him by a bony shoulder and threw him back over the lower bunk of the cell. Johnny's head bounced off the wall. One of the town flatfoots came down and stared in, chewing gum methodically. He gave barely a glance to Johnny the Itch. The latter crouched there, frozen, hanging on to his hat as if it were a hunk of dynamite. Lighting a fresh cigarette, Big Sid paid no attention to the copper. He was thinking what to do. He pulled at a vest button and picked up the thread again. She had been all set. He had given the office to Sonny Williams. Williams had planted the second heap at the old barn, and they had picked him up and rolled into Duffyville. Right on the nose. At 12:08, according to his wristwatch. Dropped off Williams on that residential street around the corner from the bank. Swung around the block. The timing was perfection. He, Big Sid, went up the bank steps as Williams came along less than 10 yards away. Williams with that long bundle under his arm that looked like a florist's box. The submachine gun was in that box. A local tradesman was just leaving the bank, nodded to Mr. Norris. Then he, Big Sid, was over dropping his left hand on that guard's arm, asking affably for the vice president. He had left for lunch, of course, and Sid slid the automatic from his side pocket and tucked it in the guard's side.
"This is a stick-up, stupid. Keep your pants on and don't try to be a hero. Now, pass me through."
The guard's lips fell loosely away from his plates. He twisted his eyes over toward Williams. Williams was at a desk, the florist box lying in front of him, scribbling on a deposit slip. But Williams knew what was going on. The guard nodded his head on the fierce, stiffened hinge of his neck, and looked down at Eklund in the far cage, the only teller on now. The guard pointed toward the electrically controlled door in the teller cage partition that cut off the offices and vault from the customer's side. Eklund was looking down, smiling at Mr. Norris. Eklund nodded. He pressed a button in his cage. The door down the line clicked. And he, Big Sid, was through. Inside, it went smooth as grease. Williams was over, the Tommy gun out. He herded the guard into a corner where he was hidden from the teller as well as any passers-by. Behind the partition, he, Big Sid, wasted only a single glance at the open vault. That would have been the stupid move. He was too smart for that. He moved swiftly down behind the empty cages toward Eklund's, walking on his toes. His left foot hit a discarded paper bill binder, and it crackled, and he pulled away from it, so he struck one of those adding machines on a portable carriage. It jolted and rattled loudly, but Eklund did not look around. Then he was right behind him, had the automatic snout poking through the steel grill of the rear of the cage, square at Eklund's back, smack at the belt of his pinchback coat.
"This is a stick-up, Eklund," he said quietly. "Don't try to be a hero or I'll blow you out of your shoes."
There was no sign from Eklund. He stood motionless, writing hand poised over a voucher.
"Now you're showing sense," he congratulated Eklund. "Now back up easy and unhook this."
There was a low whistle. That would be Williams. It meant a depositor had come in. Williams had moved around to cover him with the Tommy gun, and that meant Eklund could see him and the gun now. Eklund's jaw unhinged, and the pencil slid from his limp hand and fell to the floor. He peered forward, making gagging sounds.
"I told you this was a stick-up,"
he, Big Sid, told him, speaking louder now.
"I got a gun on your back. Make a move for that alarm and I'll give it to you. I'm not fooling, Eklund."
There was a long second ticking off into eternity. That Eklund almost acted as if he didn't hear. His head never even started to twitch toward the rear. One of his hands clawed at the counter in front of him. Then he was moving, his right leg, shakily but purposefully, toward that pedal that sounded the hold-up alarm, flashing it right to local police headquarters.
"Eklund, I'll kill."
But Eklund's foot never halted, and he, Big Sid, let him have it in the back, twice, point blank. But even as he tumbled, buckling forward in the middle, twisting with agony, Eklund's foot found the pedal, punched it. The damage was done. The bank resounded with the strident clamor of the gong, and Big Sid knew its twin was galvanizing them down at police headquarters. He ran for it, was moving even before the teller's slumping body hit the floor. Got through the partition door. He had even thought to block the snap lock with a paper wad. Williams was going out, going down the steps. The Tommy began to chatter. Then it was clattering down on the sidewalk, Williams crumpling over it with two slugs in his body. That cop coming out of the hardware store down the block happened to be a crack shot. He, Big Sid, had sent him scurrying back with one well-aimed slug, though. Then headed for the car parked down beyond the no parking zone directly in front of the bank. He always believed in keeping the law when nothing was to be gained by breaking it. He was smart that way. It was the cop running from across the street who got him in the wrist and made him lose the automatic. A lucky shot. Still, he might have made it. He got the car between them. He was almost at it, lunging for that open front door on the curbside. Johnny the Itch was quaking in there behind the wheel, hands up at his ears, yapping, "Gripes, I give up! I give up!" Big Sid had always known how yellow Johnny was. That didn't bother him. He could take care of him when he got inside, got to that stubby .38 he had slipped into the glove compartment just in case. But he never got to it. The police car, roaring up from behind, siren a scream, smashed into the tail end of their job, jolted it ahead savagely, and with one foot on the running board, he was slammed to the ground hard, rolling his head against a tree. Then they had him. Him and Johnny the Itch. Only Johnny didn't count. Big Sid shook his head. He still couldn't figure how it had happened. It was crazy, that guy Eklund committing suicide like that. Something had gone wrong, but Johnny the Itch crept closer across the cell to Big Sid, shooting nervous glances toward the door. He admired Big Sid tremendously. Big Sid was so plenty smart, not a dumb cluck like him. He didn't blame Big Sid for what had happened. It couldn't be his fault. Big Sid never made a mistake. He could think. Maybe he had figured out what had gone wrong by now. He would ask him, then tell him what he had. It was dangerous to interrupt him when he was thinking, but time was growing short. And then, when he knew, Big Sid would figure out a way to use it. Johnny put a hand to his jammed-down hat and spoke. "Sid, you got it figured how we was double-crossed, maybe? What slipped? I know you figured it right." His voice squeaked out of his throat. But Sid, I got something you can figure on now. Maybe I got..." Big Sid whirled on him, one of his heavy hands sweeping. He batted Johnny the Itch's fedora onto the side of his head. Johnny clutched at it as if it might be a life-preserver. He started. "Sid, I gotta..." One of the county homicide men came to the cell door. He plucked the cold cigar from his mouth and nodded at Big Sid. "You're lucky, pal. The hospital says Eklund, the teller, will pull through. If he hadn't, it would have been first degree and the hot squat for you." Big Sid sneered.
"Ah, that dumbhead Eklund. He wanted to be a hero. He was asking for it."
He spat disgustedly onto the floor.
"If he'd had any sense, he wouldn't have gone for the alarm. I told him I had a gun in his back."
The homicide man shook his head. "He never heard you."
"But I was only 2 feet away. I told him twice, and..."
"Eklund was stone deaf, chum," the homicide man said. Big Sid's lips curled, as if somebody had tried to tell him a fairy story.
"Why, I talked to that chump many a time.
The homicide man agreed on that one. "Yeah, facing him, so he could look at you and your lips. Eklund was a lip reader, and he was stone deaf, Cloris." Big Sid swayed. He might have pulled it off if that guy hadn't been deaf. Could have. He swore, raking his hair savagely.
"I never figured on that. I never figured..."
You never figured that?" Johnny the Itch was on his feet when he screamed. His splinter of jaw jerked out fiercely. "You, Big Sid, the smart guy, you never figured. You was dumb." But he couldn't seem to believe it. Then he did. He jerked off his fedora, grabbing inside it. He came out with the stubby .38 from the glove compartment. He had been able to slip it out in the excitement after the capture. Nobody ever paid much attention to Johnny the Itch, any more than they had thought to look under his hat when they searched him. He said it again to Big Sid. "You was dumb." Then he just kept triggering until the gun was emptied and he had put 5 slugs fatally into Big Sid's carcass. End of Death is Deaf by Cliff Campbell.